to. I've been just really impressed by reading about some of the work that various folks in your group have been doing, and this is work that's really personal to me because I'm somebody that's from one of the sort of quintessential deindustrialized sort of downwardly mobile rural working class places in Indiana that that a lot of us are trying to figure out how we can more effectively communicate with people like those from my own family. And so I'm just really appreciative of the work that you're all doing and really excited by the opportunity to learn more about it. So what I'm going to do today is, well, first of all, as Erica said, one of the things that I do in addition to being a scholar of Latin America, which is my main job, is I work partly with a new research collective of some political scientists and sociologists and historians called the Center for Working Class Politics. And we basically started about a year ago as an informal group mainly, but we have as our goal to put out research projects using sort of new and interesting qualitative and quantitative and experimental methods, trying to look at new and interesting angles to the question of how can we, as progressives, but also Democrats more broadly, appeal more effectively to working class voters of all kinds in the United States, because we believe, just sort of from an empirical standpoint, that there's many places in the U.S. where progressives in particular and Democrats in general, just the math isn't there to cobble together winning and sustainable coalitions without trying to maintain and actually increase our support among working class folks in those states. And then from a sort of a moral perspective, if we sort of give up on sort of working class voters we just think are unwinnable, we're just leaving them out there to be mobilized by the right in a really dangerous way. So that's what we're all about. The first project that we did, sort of larger scale project, was the one I'm going to be presenting on today, which was we basically, as a first step, just wanted to know, which sorts of progressive candidates have actually done better or worse in sort of predominantly working class. And for this survey, we were particularly interested in sort of non-college educated working class voters, who are the sort of most difficult voters in many cases for progressives and Democrats to reach, not just white, but also, as we've seen, in the sort of significant shift of Latino voters away from the Democrats between 2016 and 2020. Also other segments of this group, among Latinos and African Americans. We wanted to see, well, basically which progressives are doing better in reaching these voters. But we quickly learned that, not many Democrats compete in sort of competitive congressional districts that are predominantly non-college educated, and a much smaller, almost negligible number of progressive candidates within the Democratic Party do so. And those that do, they don't do very well in general, at least not in 2018 or 2020 from the data that we were looking at. And so basically there just isn't enough data for us to know which sorts of progressive politicians are going to appeal most to the sorts of non-college educated working class voters that we're interested in learning about. So we decided that as one way to get a handle on, hypothetically, what this might look like if there in fact were more progressives competing in these sorts of places and appealing to these sorts of voters, we decided to do a survey experiment, basically, where we would just randomly generate candidate profiles that varied across a bunch of dimensions that I'll tell you about in just a couple of minutes. And then we would basically show voters these, and so here's an example of what we did. We would show voters sort of these randomly generated hypothetical candidates who varied across, gender, race, ethnicity, and then sorts of policy priorities and messaging styles. And we would basically ask them to choose which of the two candidates they preferred. And then we would have each voter do that respondent do that every five or six times. And then so basically we have thousands of hypothetical candidates that we can compare, and that can give us some relatively precise estimates of which sorts of candidate characteristics appeal to working class voters in a way that we couldn't do just by looking at sort of elections data and pairing that with known demographic information of candidates. So we worked with Jacobin, which is a sort of a left-wing magazine, and YouGov to field a 2,000 person survey of non-college educated working class voters. We restricted our sample to exclude people who self-identified as strong Republicans on the theory that they are outside the even hypothetical voter universe of Democrats. So we wanted to just see which sorts of people that would potentially be winnable by Democrats, would be moved by different sorts of candidates. We decided to look at 5 swing states because we wanted to look at relatively competitive contexts. So that varied in different sorts of demographic ways: Nevada, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina. And for the purposes, that are felicitous for this group, we decided to oversample rural small town voters who came from zip codes that were denominated by YouGov as rural small town. So over half the sample came from those zip codes. So we can make comparisons comparing the responses of rural small town non-college educated voters in swing states to urban suburban voters to see sort of what sorts of trade-offs, if any, there may be in terms of their preferences for different sorts of candidates. So that's what we did. And we had a lot of different findings in the survey report that we put out, looking at different responses across different segments of the working class and across race, gender, ethnicity, background, et cetera. But for this presentation, since it's the Rural Urban Bridge Initiative, I thought I would just focus on the results that pertain to rural voters, rural small town voters, and then looking at any relevant differences that we saw between those voters, or not just voters, because we also included non-voters, and also comparing them to suburban urban voters to see if there were any systematic differences. These are the characteristics that we tested. Each candidate got one of the values of each candidate characteristic. Most of these are straightforward, but a couple of just to clarify what we mean by them. We wanted to sort of get a sense of how people responded to the top issue that a candidate might focus on, like the thing that they always lead with on a stump speech, or the thing that comes first on their literature or their website, or in their tweets. So that's what we call day one priority. But we also, of course, know that candidates don't just run on one thing. So we also gave each candidate a bundle of issues based on economic issues, civil rights issues, and healthcare issues. And we gave them each one of those 3 values from each key issue area, so that we could see not only what's the top issue, the thing that they care about most, and how does that affect voters, but also the sort of bundle of other issues that they're going to bring up on the campaign trail. And we had what we considered to be like a progressive value, a sort of centrist value, and a more conservative value for each of those 3 issue areas. And then finally, we know that candidates are not evaluated just on their policy issues. In fact, sometimes very little, but also on the sort of messaging style that they use. So we culled together a bunch of speeches and public statements from different key figures within the Democratic Party, and we just came up with 2 to 3 sentence sound bites to give a sense of the style, the messaging style of people from different parts of the Democratic Party. One being sort of more pugilistic, us versus them, sort of class-based progressive narrative, which would be the sort of Bernie Sanders. We use language from him. One which is similarly progressive and sort of us versus them, progressive focus, but using language that's a little bit less plain spoken, a little bit less straightforward, and sometimes uses language that we might associate more with sort of liberal or progressive activist circles, and less with the way that we might speak to just our working class cousins. And that was the sort of the AOC inspired language. And then we had a similar distinction of sort of more centrist messaging, sort of rather than us versus them messaging, it was more reach across the aisle, be pragmatic. And we had a sort of activist versus sort of plain spoken version of each of those. So the activist moderate versus the mainstream moderate. And that was language we took from Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, respectively. So do you have a question? Oh, sorry, I heard somebody. And then we also had a generic Republican so that we could just sort of compare, especially like with respect to swing voters, how the Democratic messaging was going to hold up versus the Republican messaging. Okay, so that's the setup for the survey. I don't have a ton of time to go through lots of findings, but I want to just highlight some of the potentially most interesting ones. And if you have questions about anything else related to the findings that I don't present here, obviously feel free to bring that up in the question and answer, and we can do that. So for most of these slides, I've just broken down the results in terms of small town rural, which is the blue dots with the confidence intervals, and then the yellow being the suburban urban voters, right? And so the first thing that I'll present is the messaging style. So we find, interestingly, that the sort of Bernie Sanders style us versus them messaging was the most favored by rural small town voters, who seem to respond well to this sort of sense of, there is a class war going on in some sense. And they felt like those candidates were more appealing. And the difference between, the populist progressive and the mainstream moderate, which is the Joe Biden one, is statistically significant here. So there really is a meaningful difference in the small town rural voters, respondents' views of the sort of, plain spoken, sort of us versus them rhetoric versus all the other Democratic messaging styles. I've left off the Republican one here because for all these estimates, it was very low, relatively speaking. I just want to zoom in on the Democratic ones. But we do see kind of a trade-off, right? So if you're using that Sanders style messaging among rural and urban voters, it's actually less appealing, not surprisingly to me anyway, among suburban and urban voters who preferred, not surprisingly, given the fact that he won a presidential election last year, the Biden style messaging. So there's some sense in which, trying to figure out the right messaging style, there is a kind of a trade-off potentially suggested by our findings, with respect to rural small town versus urban suburban voters. Okay. So one other interesting thing that we found, there's a lot of debates about, well, is there some sort of penalty that's paid by minority candidates or female candidates? Obviously, there was a lot of discussion about that with the presidential election in 2016. And we found that actually, no, there's no penalty whatsoever. And this is in line with, a burgeoning and increasingly large body of literature in political science in the US and elsewhere, suggesting, but in our case, not only that African-American and women candidates, face no penalty relative to, white and male candidates, but actually in the case of African-American candidates, did better than all other candidates, both among suburban, urban, as well as small town rural voters. And the same thing is true of female candidates who were preferred, although the difference is relatively minor, across the board compared to male candidates. So there's no sense in which, if we're talking about which sorts of candidate recruitment styles, to utilize in trying to attract, sort of working class voters in small town rural areas, there's no, sort of negative effect of coming from a minority background. In fact, there's a positive one in some cases. When we turn to the top priority issues, so this is like, what's their day one thing that they're going to focus on once elected? We see some interesting suburban city versus small town rural divergences as well, like we saw, with the messaging style. So first, we see, so again, the blue is a small town rural, the yellow is suburban versus urban. We see that the small town rural respondents responded much more favorably towards candidates who focused on what you might call sort of bread and butter economic issues like jobs, healthcare, economy. And they were much less favorable toward candidates whose primary focus was racial justice or immigration, say. And we don't see that same divergence at all, or with a slight, exception of immigration, among suburban urban voters, for whom, basically there was little distinction, no statistically significant distinction across top priority issues. So there is, again, a kind of a trade-off here wherein it does seem like the small town rural voters are responding more to the sort of, universally applicable bread and butter issues, whereas that's less of a trade-off amongst suburban and urban voters. So that's something to consider. Looking at this by racial breakdown is really interesting, which I'll talk about in a minute, to see sort of how this varies across race, both within small town rural voters and suburban city voters. One other thing that I'll just mention here, when it came to the progressive, or when it came to the issue areas, so this bundle of economic, healthcare, and also civil rights issues, we found that sort of pretty bold progressive issues like Medicare for all and end systemic racism were actually preferred over the alternatives, or at least were as favorably viewed as all the centrist or conservative alternatives, both among suburban and city dwellers, as well as the small town rural respondents. Of course, as you can see here, the suburban and city dwellers preferred, they had a stronger positive preference for these progressive policy issues than small town rural voters did. But nonetheless, the small town rural voters did respond quite favorably to these pretty bold progressive issues. And that's especially interesting in the case of the racial justice component, because as I just mentioned, the small town rural voters, they were pretty clear in favoring people whose day one priority was racial justice, less than those who focused on the sort of bread and butter economic issues. Nonetheless, here they're also saying that we think that racial justice, even a pretty bold statement of your commitment to ending systemic racism, is something that we find very appealing and that we find to be important for a candidate relative to these sort of colorblind or even conservative alternatives. So, I mean, there's different ways to interpret that, but the way that I think about it is some voters may feel like they're in such an economically desperate position, or they just feel like, this was in the middle of COVID, we did this, they're so precarious economically that they really want a candidate whose primary focus is jobs or economy. But even these small town rural voters really do care, and not just the voters of color, but even white voters really do care about racial justice, and they sort of value candidates that focus on those issues. The one interesting thing that we found that was a little bit puzzling, which I'm not exactly sure what to make of, is that even though sort of small town rural voters said jobs was the number one thing that they wanted a candidate to focus on, when we gave them a progressive jobs plank, which was like a jobs guarantee, that didn't move them at all. In fact, they didn't have any sense of that affecting their views of candidates at all. And maybe that's because people are just not aware of what that means. Maybe it's because they think it's too pie in the sky as a policy. Although, why would they support Medicare for all? And not that, I don't know, but that is an interesting finding that we took away as well. So basically, I've gone on a bit longer already than I planned to. But just before closing up, I just wanted to say one thing. Oh, sorry, you had a question? I see a question.
Yeah, I just said clarification on the bottom graph. Can you just, what am I looking at in the bottom graph? What is that showing me?
Okay, apologies for not making that clear earlier. So basically the bottom graph is just showing whether or not the difference between the yellow and the blue is meaningful statistically, right? So the only differences that we see, like Medicare for all, there's suburban city dwellers really liked Medicare for all much more than the small town rural voters. So that's just a way of sort of parsing out, what the difference is between the blue and the yellow. I mean, apologies for not saying that earlier, but yes, that's what it is. Thank you for that. So the last thing that I would just point out before sort of opening up to questions and comments is when it comes to the sort of racial breakdown here, there was a really interesting finding, which is that when we look at the sort of candidate messaging by race and within small town rural versus urban suburban respondents, the people that are driving the really strong preference for the populist progressive, the Bernie Sanders style, us versus them class-based messaging, are partly the white respondents from the small town rural areas. So you can see that the white respondents, had a 58% favorability toward these candidates, which was higher than, any of the other candidates of this messaging styles. But it was really the African-American respondents who responded much more strongly to this. 73% of the time, they supported a candidate who used that sort of messaging, compared to the other sorts of candidates. So that's really interesting to see that it's those sorts of African-American small town rural voters who are responding so positively to that messaging, even though, on the campaign trail in 2020 during the primaries, those were not the voters you would have expected to, to respond well to, like, say, Bernie Sanders, which is interesting. So maybe it was something specific to him as a candidate, rather than that messaging style per se. Whereas in the suburban and urban setting, African-American voters basically didn't show any difference, or respondents didn't show any difference in their preferences for, these different sorts of messaging styles. So it really is the small town rural African-American and white voters who are driving the overall tendency we're seeing towards supporting that sort of more, progressive us versus them class-based messaging. So there's a lot more that I could say, but I've already gone on long enough. And so I'll just leave, we have a bunch of upcoming projects we're working on, building on this and working on other questions. And I'm happy to talk about those. And of course, to also get into details of any other aspects of the survey that I didn't have time to touch on. So I'll stop there, and thank you so much for, allowing me to present. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jared. Wow, I think this is such incredibly interesting and valuable information. I'm gonna ask people to raise their Zoom hand or their for their actual hand if you have questions or comments, and I'll ask Cody to help me spot people who have questions. And while people are queuing up their questions, Jared, maybe just one thing that would be great is if you could you give an example of the actual messages that were used? There we go. You anticipated my question. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I will just sort of leave this here. So while we're talking, you can sort of read through it, because I mean, it would take, you know, a while to read through all of them. But, you know, basically you can see here that the main axes that we're looking at is like whether or not there is like sort of us versus them sort of, you know, progressive messaging on the one hand, and that's the sort of both the progressive candidates. And then also whether or not there's like very plain spoken language or language that utilizes terminology that, you know, might be less familiar to some working class voters, and might be stuff that I would be more likely to use at my activist meeting in Cambridge or something like that. That was sort of the idea that we were going for. Now, I mean, people may have comments about this, and they're totally, and so I'll just say right up front that obviously all of these messaging styles are very dependent upon the specific language that we use. And so we are running a couple of other surveys to follow up with this, like looking at, you know, how we change the messaging style in different ways and seeing how sensitive the results are to that. So, I mean, this is just one survey. We're not trying to make overly blown, conclusions, but, you know, nonetheless, you know, there are some interesting suggestions from what we found.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to ask whoever has a dog in the background to
That's
mute
me. I'm so
yourself.
sorry.
Oh, no. Okay. Well, we're not going to ask you to mute yourself then.
She's very annoyed. She's in the other room.
Okay. Let's see. Anthony.
Yeah, wow, this is really cool stuff, Jared. Thank you so much. I've got 3 or 4 questions, some of them real quick. Tell me again when you did this research. What is the time frame that this went out?
January to February of 2021.
Okay, and the survey of respondents, whether they were urban, suburban, or small town, they were all non-college educated individuals?
Yes.
Okay, all right. And are you saying that the Republican message, as you display it here, and of course different variants of that depending on the issue, what was non-competitive in all, you know, relatively speaking, compared to either the populist progressive or the more moderate mainstream message across the issues?
I know that sounds crazy until you hear that we excluded people who self-identify as strong Republicans from the sample. So that excludes about 25% of the electorate. We were only interested in sort of who would potentially be persuadable. Now, that said, the one last thing that I would emphasize is that if I had shown you the results not of urban versus rural, but rather, you know, Democrat or lean Democrat versus independent, then actually the Republican messaging does become competitive across many of these dimensions. But I didn't show you that because I was focused just on the urban-rural divide. But the independents in our sample definitely did view the Republican soundbites and policies as just as competitive as some of the Democratic ones, depending on the case.
Okay, thank you for that. And one last thing, and then I'll shut up. Somebody has asked if it's possible to access this report, and I'm assuming that's the case.
Yes, of course. I can find the link and send it out to you guys. I think it was in the email invitation too that Erica sent out.
Okay, great.
Yeah, the full report is there. Yeah, I don't see anyone else at the moment. So I'll ask another question. I'm wondering if in your future iterations, as you're refining new, potential tweaks on the messaging, if you're gonna incorporate any of the race class narrative messages, which have also been field tested very successfully, and in particular seem effective at kind of undermining the Republican racial dog whistling that's like inevitable in every single election.
Yeah, we actually we are going to do that in one of our upcoming surveys. We're basically going to reconfigure like these sound bites like in a structure that pretty much approximates what they did with the race class narrative messaging, and then we're going to have sort of like a race conscious colorblind, which is what they already have in their previous study. And then we're going to actually include like a couple of different like alternative forms of messaging. And then in addition to that, we're also going to sort of, as they did, we're going to sort of see like how well these hold up with or without like Republican messaging, but we're also going to test how well they hold up with or without different kinds of messaging in different media outlets. So we're going to be doing very related stuff. So yeah, I didn't actually know about that report until after we had like done the survey. But when I did find out about it, I was like, oh yes, obviously we need to be in closer conversation with what they're doing.
Yeah, great. When is that next wave of research going to be available?
I don't know yet, but probably we're going to field it in the next 2 months. So I would think by the summer at the latest.
Okay, we'll have to have you back then. Sage, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jared, for the awesome presentation. And I was just curious, was there any distinction in results between rural versus small town groups, if you're able to kind of make that distinction?
Yes, there were. There were actually some really interesting differences there that we can get at, because we have basically the same, about the same amount of small town versus rural voters. So if you're at all interested in just the basic findings there, then maybe just send me an email and I can literally just like do a quick report for you to show what we found, the distinctions between those two voters. I can't remember all the specifics now, but I'd be happy to send you a brief report if that's something that you would want to dig more into.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. Thank you so much.
Jared, thanks so much for this presentation. Can you ask a little or talk a little bit about how voters responded to like these general categories versus like within the issues themselves? Was there more of like I guess what I'm trying to get at is there more of like a stylistic difference that's important, or are voters really responding to more granular, like issue specific arguments?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, you can sort of see just by looking at the range of the estimates here. So you could see, like, with respect to the messaging, right? The range, of the progressive messaging goes from about 52% as the lowest one. So all of these were net positive because we're also comparing them against a Republican, right? And then the upper bound was about 60%. So there's about an 8 percentage point difference, in the sort of like, so that's how impactful going from the least popular to the most popular was. And then when you look at some of these issue areas, you see that for the small town rural voters in particular, the variation is basically smaller. So that the greatest difference would be from about 50% to maybe 56%. Although for some of these suburban city voters, the variation was maybe 8 or 9%. So basically, I would say that both were capable of affecting voters' preferences of candidates by anywhere between like 4 and 6%. So the range isn't all that different, but the messaging overall might have had a greater impact, but not by much.
I'm not sure if I'm asking the same question that Cody just did or different, but what I'm wondering is if in future iterations, are you gonna experiment with different ways of messaging around each of these issues? So like different ways of trying to talk about Medicare for all, if that's their position, and different ways of trying to sell voters on a jobs guarantee, if that's their position.
Yeah, we are. So we have another thing we're doing, which is basically, we don't really like the way that, most of the time people think about like intensity of preferences. Like most of the time people just use like a Likert scale saying like, oh, I like something from 0 to 7 or whatever in terms of message. So we're doing this thing called a quadratic voting experiment, where we basically like play a game where we give people like 100 points and they have to say like, I like issue number 1, 5 points. But if they like issue 1, 5 points, then they can only like other issues by like 3 points, and it goes up quadratically, so that they really have to think about what issues and what types of framing they care about the most. And so we're using that framework to test like a couple dozen different variations on progressive economic messaging. And one of those is jobs related messaging, and another one is healthcare. So that's going to be maybe our second one down the road. But yeah, that we're very interested in that question as well. And in general, if folks have ideas of stuff that you've always just wanted to know about, and that you think might be interesting, we're super excited to have any additional ideas that you might have that could be interesting to test.
Great. Jen, do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to read out your question from the chat?
Oh, I can, sorry, I'm like making dinner over here while listening.
Okay.
So then I can move to a better angle. Hold on. Sorry, I can never like get everything done. Yeah, I was just like, I'm an ethnographer. I'm not a political scientist, and I don't do survey research. So those are all like but I was sort of wondering, like, I'm having, based on like ethnography I've done or watching like recent elections, like how do we understand this preference for Black candidates or women, or preferences to like end systemic racism with, like, for example, what just happened in Virginia? And is it that we are not understanding like the right audience, or could there be like some social desirability in the survey where people are like, I don't see race, I don't see gender, or even like white people thinking systemic racism is against them? Like, do you have any sense of what could be happening?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's something that we definitely need to look into more. But the way we've been talking about it, and we're actually doing like one of the other things on the agenda is to basically ask the same sorts of questions about candidates in a couple of rural and small town working class focus groups that we want to kind of follow up and get a little bit more into the weeds on this stuff. I wish I could spend the time you did writing that beautiful book about working class folks in Pennsylvania. But my sense so far is that like the voters, the same working class folks said that in small and rural areas said that they didn't want candidates to focus primarily on racial justice or immigration, but they didn't mind. In fact, they were quite positive to talking about those issues as part of a broader bundle. So the way we're sort of like interpreting that, perhaps optimistically, is that folks, like, it's a matter of sort of messaging style, and it's a matter of sort of like the emphasis that you place. So just like any good organizer, you go on the door, if you're talking with somebody that you totally disagree with, but you really need to bring up a difficult issue, you're going to lead with something that there's common ground on, and then they might be less defensive or less getting their back up, talking about something that may be more controversial. So that's what we're kind of thinking maybe going on. It's also really important to reemphasize that this survey does not include strong Republicans. So all of these estimates are going to seem a little bit more optimistic if you're not keeping that in mind. But I think it's a really important question that we don't have a great answer to yet. But at the very least, our survey gives some hopeful evidence that there may be something more to look into here, and trying to parse out how we could more effectively sort of talk about those sort of issues among voters that often are perceived as not being very amenable to that.
That makes sense. I think in my own interview work, like, there's a lot more nuance in race and racism than often comes across too.
Great, thanks, Jen. Larry Wohlers.
Yes, hello. I'm part of a small new group in rural, at least what's left of rural in Northern Virginia, called
That's where I'm from too. So
Rural Virginia. And we do a monthly newsletter. We've started recently focusing on issues that pertain to rural areas. But one of our impressions talking with our neighbors is that there's a lot of openness to issues and ideas among people. But that when it comes down to voting, people are saying, all my friends and family are voting Republican. Of course, I'm voting Republican too. So it's sort of almost a cultural identity vote. And so we're not sure that focusing on issues is actually reaching anybody in terms of actually changing their vote. Just curious of your thoughts, if anything of that sense, true or false, came up in the research you were doing?
Yeah, well, that's a really good point. I mean, like the degree to which any campaign can affect the outcome of an election is pretty small, right? Like even the most optimistic estimates that I've ever read of really sophisticated quantitative analyses of say like the overall impact of the Obama campaign in 2012 was like, well, maybe it had like a 4 or 5 point impact, which that might not sound a lot, but it's actually really, really big, right? So so our optimistic assumption is that yes, we know that there are many over-determining factors, in terms of polarization, in terms of economic dislocation, let's go down the line, that mean that it's very unlikely that whatever candidates do in terms of recruitment or messaging style is going to have a major impact on these voters. But nonetheless, we think this is one of the few things that we as activists working on electoral campaigns can actually influence. And so even if it's a relatively small impact, we might as well think carefully about how we can maximize that impact. So I mean, that's basically what I say. Yes, I think probably on the margins there can be meaningful effects of this kind of work, but they're not going to be more than that, because even the best campaigns, under the best circumstances, don't have a huge effect on the outcome of elections.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. We've got time for a couple more, and I see Jeff and then Cal. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, that was great, interesting stuff, Jared. Thank you. And I have one little question, one big question. The little question is, it might be interesting, and I don't know if you have the resources to do this. It would be to, rather than written positions of these candidates, a video presentation a la an ad, and not like an actual ad, but like a sort of 30-second clip of who this person might be, and with the full sort of semiotics of who this person might be, of like the how you would dress, how you would look, where the setting would be, might be an interesting way to test some of these type things that are, because what you seem to me to capturing is a level of nuance, that, as Larry was suggesting, is a level of nuance that might not be prevalent in the vast majority of voters' minds. So that's like a little stylistic approach that might be interesting. Comments welcome, or forget it. But that does connect to my larger question, which is there a way to think about narrative and each party's story? Because also connected to what sort of Larry was suggesting with polarization and regionalization and the rural-urban question, it seems that this level of granularity, maybe if you're knocking on doors, is particularly relevant. But in general, in terms of the framing of candidates, of party positions, the Republicans have a story, and the Democrats don't. That seems to make this sort of these divides very easy to fall into, this polarization all the more sort of easy and reflexive, and making kind of that same granularity that Larry was just talking about a little less relevant. So I guess I'm wondering, how come, is there a way to think about story and narrative of what each party means that can be brought into this kind of survey?
I mean, I think that, well, on your first question, yeah, I mean, the video thing would be amazing, but the problem is that it gets really expensive because, we're talking about doing one where we're doing short videos of just like the sound bites with real candidates, but then the problem is like, we need to do like, the white version and the African-American, and then so pretty soon you have to hire a lot of different actors, and then you need to have a big grant, and it gets really, really expensive. That's why people don't do that very much, but it is a great idea. But on the narrative thing, I mean, I think that it's really hard to capture the level of nuance that you're talking about in terms of talking with voters about, how sorts of these narratives or lack thereof in the case of the Democrats affect the way voters think. And I'm not entirely sure that that a survey is actually the best way to get at that. I think doing some of the sort of more ethnographic work that Jennifer Silva was talking about, or in our case, focusing sort of on doing some focus groups, which is what we're trying to do in some of our future work, and to try to get at maybe the impact of the sort of broader narratives of these of the parties and how they're perceived, might be better. But I genuinely agree with you that, there are pretty, significant limitations into the broader utility of this sort of research, to things beyond, sort of short to medium term messaging approaches. So I'm not trying to make any more grandiose claims. And I agree with you that that is a significant limitation of what we're doing, that we need to supplement with more qualitative approaches.
Okay, and our last question will be Kel, and then I just want to remind everyone after we close out, if anyone would like to stick around for an informal after chat for 10 or 15 minutes, you're cordially invited to. Go ahead, Kel.
Hello. I saw a few references earlier in the report to Facebook and Twitter, but was there any breakdown between interviewees who had access to the internet and those who didn't? I mean, this might not be a factor, where you were interviewing, but in our little part of Southwest Virginia, a lot of people don't have access to the internet. So is there any breakdown according to where they're getting their information from, basically?
That's a wonderful question. And yes, we did ask about access to the internet. And, there definitely are a significant number of the rural voters that I don't remember the breakdown, but short answer is yes, we could figure that out. Second answer is I don't remember. So if you're interested in that, I'd be happy to do the same thing we talked about earlier, which is sort of just send a brief summary of, how these results vary, based on, sort of how you get your, your media or access to the internet. Because, you're raising very important, questions that I just don't know the answer to off the top of my head, but I could get for you.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for great questions and a great discussion. And Jared, thanks so much for presenting all of this. We will definitely keep in touch as this research evolves. I think it's going to be so important and useful for all of us. So thanks for being here. Feel free to stick around or leave if you need to now. And I'm going to turn it over to Jaleesa Ward, who will lead our after chat.
Thank you, Erica. Well, I guess we'll hang tight and we can see who has an additional 10 to 15 minutes so we can continue discussing Jared's presentation and anybody else's perspective that you guys want to talk about just regarding progressive candidates, our rural communities and the rural divider, or just anything of just what's on your mind or what's on your heart. So we can still do a raise hand format, or you guys are feel free to chip in if you just want to talk additionally about Jared's presentation or anything that you'd like to share that could help educate us on just moving forward.
Hey, this is Sarah. Unfortunately, I have to go in a sec because I have to drive my husband back over to the other farm because we're having cold weather car problems. But anyways, one thing that I thought